So there I was, Cadet Riley Murphy, the only human stupid enough to enroll at the Galactic Military Academy on HFY. And let me tell you, when the recruitment brochure said challenging environment, they really meant we're going to make your life a living nightmare because you have the audacity to exist without natural armor plating. Picture this, a military academy designed by aliens for aliens where the morning calisthenics involved dodging plasma bolts while balancing on crystalline spires. Easy enough if you happen to have gecko feet and bulletproof skin. Slightly more challenging when you're a squishy human whose greatest evolutionary advantage is the ability to sweat profusely and make really bad decisions. My daily routine went something like this. Wake up at 0500 to the sound of Commander Thexulos screaming in Vorthan about how humans are walking safety violations. Thexulos looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a particularly angry accountant, complete with horn-rimmed glasses perched on his armored snout. His favorite hobby was finding new and creative ways to remind everyone that humans didn't belong in civilized military institutions. Then there was Prince Veltar, a Zephyrian noble who treated the academy like his personal entertainment venue. Veltar had that annoying habit of floating 3 feet off the ground at all times, just to make sure everyone remembered he was better than them. His species looked like they'd been designed by someone who really loved the color purple and had strong opinions about the aerodynamic properties of flowing robes. My roommate Pip was the exception to the general hostility. She was a Quillen, which meant she looked like a cross between a hedgehog and a calculator, and she had this adorable tendency to communicate in mathematical equations when she got nervous, which, considering she was rooming with the Academy's designated disaster magnet, was pretty much constantly. The probability of your survival through basic combat training is approximately 0.7%, she'd informed me on my first day, her quills rattling with anxiety. Would you like me to calculate your insurance requirements? The thing about alien military training is that it's designed around the assumption that everyone has some kind of natural advantage. The Vorthans with their armor plating practiced light sparring that would qualify as attempted murder by Earth standards. The Zephyrians did aerial maneuvers that defied at least 3 laws of physics I could name. And the Quillens ran tactical simulations in their heads faster than most civilizations could build computers. Me? I got to be the control group, the baseline. The let's see how badly a human can fail at this experimental subject. But here's the thing about growing up in the Australian outback with a grandmother who fixed starship engines for a living, you learn to adapt. When your morning chores include wrestling the occasional crocodile away from the water recycler and jury-rigging hyperspace motivators with whatever spare parts you can scavenge, then you develop what my gran called creative problem-solving skills. Everyone else called it barely contained chaos. 3 months into what I generously called my educational experience, the Academy announced the annual Trial of Worthiness. Traditionally, this was a diplomatic simulation where officer candidates demonstrated their ability to negotiate peace treaties and manage interspecies conflicts. You know, the kind of thing that actually mattered for future military leaders. Naturally, they decided to change the format. I first caught wind of the modification during lunch, when I overheard Commander Thexulos talking to Prince Veltar in what they probably thought was a subtle whisper. Pro tip, when you're planning someone's demise, maybe don't do it in the mess hall where the acoustics carry every word to the cheap seats. The human has been problematic, Thexulos was saying, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for discussing particularly stubborn stains. Her continued presence undermines the Academy's reputation for excellence. Indeed, Veltar replied, floating slightly higher in what I'd learned was his equivalent of smugness. Perhaps it's time she faced a more traditional challenge. The Crimson Maw hasn't had a proper meal in weeks. I nearly choked on my protein cube. The Crimson Maw was the Academy's legendary beast, kept in the depths of the facility for what they euphemistically called character-building exercises. In practice, this meant throw someone you don't like into a pit with a monster and see what happens. Pip, who had been listening to the entire conversation while pretending to study her tactical mathematics, started vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. Probability of survival against Crimson Maw equals 0.001%. She whispered, her equations taking on an increasingly frantic quality. Margin of error, negligible. Recommended course of action, immediate evacuation to neutral space. Relax, Pip, I said, though my own confidence was hovering somewhere around the level of a particularly optimistic mayfly. How bad could it be? The answer, as I discovered through some creative eavesdropping and a bit of light computer hacking that definitely wasn't taught in any of my classes, was pretty bad. The Crimson Maw was apparently a creature of legend, undefeated in over 2 centuries of trials. It was housed in a massive underground coliseum that had been carved from living rock, and its main hobbies included collecting shiny objects and turning overconfident cadets into bite-sized snacks. The betting pool that sprang up around my impending demise was both insulting and impressive in its scope. The odds against my survival were running at about 847 to 1, and most of those bets were being placed on whether I'd last long enough to scream twice or just once. But here's what none of them knew about my background. My grandmother hadn't just been a mechanic. She'd been a terraforming engineer who'd spent 30 years turning hostile alien worlds into places humans could actually live. Her idea of child care had involved teaching me to identify and neutralize approximately 47 different types of dangerous wildlife before I was old enough to reach the cookie jar. Riley, love, she used to say while we were reprogramming the automated defense systems to stop shooting at the mailman, but the thing about dangerous creatures is that they're usually just misunderstood. Find out what they actually want, and 9 times out of 10 you can work something out. Of course, she'd also taught me that the 10th time you'd better have a really big wrench handy. As I sat in my dorm room, listening to Pip calculate increasingly dire statistics about my life expectancy, I found myself thinking about those lessons. Everyone assumed the Crimson Maw was just a mindless killing machine, but what if it wasn't? What if it was just really tired of people dropping by uninvited? The day of the trial dawned with all the enthusiasm of a funeral march, which, considering the circumstances, seemed appropriate. The entire academy gathered in the observation gallery surrounding the pit entrance, creating what looked like the galaxy's most morbid sporting event. Commander Thexulos gave a speech about proving one's mettle against the forces of chaos, which was rich coming from someone whose idea of military strategy involved throwing problems at other problems until something stuck. Prince Veltar added his own commentary about the natural order asserting itself, floating smugly above the proceedings like a purple balloon with delusions of grandeur. The platform that lowered me into the pit moved with all the speed and dignity of a garbage disposal, which seemed fitting given what everyone expected to happen to me. As I descended into the darkness, I could hear the crowd above placing last-minute bets on exactly how spectacular my failure would be. The pit itself was bigger than I'd expected. Much bigger. What I'd imagined as a simple arena turned out to be a vast underground cavern that stretched beyond the reach of the emergency lighting. The air was warm and humid, with a mineral taste that suggested we were deep beneath the Academy's foundations. And then I saw the Crimson Maw. The recruitment brochures had described it as formidable, which was like describing a supernova as bright. The creature was easily the size of a small building, with 6 legs that looked like they could punch holes through starship hulls. Its armor plating wasn't just red, it was crystalline, catching and reflecting the emergency lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When it moved, which it did with surprising grace for something that massive, the sound was like a landslide having an argument with a thunderstorm. My first instinct was the traditional human response to overwhelming danger: run around screaming and hope something good happens. But Grand's training kicked in, and I found myself studying the creature's behavior instead of just its impressive collection of teeth. The Crimson Maw wasn't charging at me like a mindless predator. It was watching. Evaluating. And unless I was completely misreading the situation, it looked about as thrilled to see me as I was to see it. "Hey there, big guy," I called out, keeping my voice calm and non-threatening. "Having a good day? Because mine's been better." The creature's head tilted slightly, which I chose to interpret as interest rather than an attempt to find my most appetizing angle. Up close, I could see that its famous hoard of shiny objects wasn't just random treasure. The collection included pieces of technology, crystalline formations, and what looked suspiciously like personal belongings from previous trials. That's when I noticed the scratches on the walls. Deep gouges that suggested the crimson maw had been trying to dig its way out for quite some time. This wasn't the lair of a content monster. This was a prison cell. "You know what," I said, settling down on a relatively comfortable-looking rock. "I bet you're just as tired of this whole setup as I am." The creature made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a rock slide. Given that those were my only reference points for friendly giant monster noises, I decided to take it as encouragement. That's when I spotted the real problem. Tiny, skittering movements in the shadows around the creature's feet. At first, I thought they were just debris, but then I recognized the telltale signs of skitter mites. Parasitic little nightmare bugs that attached themselves to large creatures and drove them slowly insane with constant irritation. "Oh, you poor thing," I said, finally understanding. "You're not angry. You're itchy." Now, I should probably mention that my grandmother's lessons in xenobiology hadn't just covered the theoretical aspects of dangerous creatures. She'd also been very practical about pest control, having dealt with everything from quantum termites to hyperspace locusts during her terraforming days. Skitter mites were particularly nasty because they were nearly impossible to remove without the right tools and techniques. They burrowed into the spaces between armor plates and set up colonies, feeding off their host's bioenergy while secreting toxins that caused constant irritation and aggressive behavior. The Crimson Maw, who I was starting to think of as Gus because he reminded me of an oversized, crystalline version of my grandmother's pet iguana, had probably been dealing with this infestation for months or even years. No wonder he was cranky. "All right, Gus," I said, getting to my feet and examining his hoard more carefully. "Let's see what we're working with here." Previous trial victims had apparently brought all sorts of useful equipment into the pit, most of which was now part of Gus's collection. I found a maintenance toolkit that looked Vorthan in origin, some Zephyrian sonic devices, and what appeared to be a complete field surgical kit from the Quillen Medical Corps. The first step was fashioning a skitter mite extractor, which involved combining the sonic frequency generator from the Zephyrian equipment with the precision tools from the surgical kit. It wasn't pretty, but Gran had always said that function mattered more than form when you were solving urgent problems. "Okay, big guy, this is going to feel weird, but trust me," I told Gus as I approached with my improvised device. "I've done this before, just never on something quite so substantial." Gus, displaying a level of intelligence that definitely wasn't mentioned in any of the Academy's monster fighting manuals, actually lowered himself down to make the hard-to-reach spots more accessible. Working together, we began the delicate process of extracting several decades' worth of parasitic infestation. The first few skitter mites came out easily enough, but the deeper colonies required more creative approaches. I ended up rigging a modified sonic pulse system that could flush them out without damaging Gus's crystalline armor. It was like performing surgery on a living gemstone while the patient provided helpful commentary in a language that consisted entirely of different types of rumbling. As we worked, Gus became noticeably more relaxed. The aggressive posturing disappeared, replaced by what I could only describe as grateful cooperation. He even started helping by using his smaller manipulator claws to hold tools and point out spots I'd missed. "You know," I said during a break in the pest removal process, "I bet you didn't choose to live down here, did you?" Gus made a sound that was unmistakably mournful, a deep harmonic that resonated through the cavern walls. He gestured with one massive claw toward the deeper tunnels that led away from the pit, and I suddenly understood. This wasn't his home. This was his prison. The Academy had been using him as an unwilling gladiator for generations, keeping him trapped in this artificial arena while his real family lived somewhere in the deep cave systems of Kethvar. The shiny objects weren't trophies. They were the only reminders he had of the outside world. "Well," I said, putting down my improvised tools and looking up at the observation galleries where I could see the dim shapes of spectators still waiting for the show, "I think it's time we did something about that. But first, we had a pest control job to finish. And maybe, just maybe, a few other problems to solve while we were at it. I may have also accidentally on purpose shorted out a few monitoring systems with some creative applications of the sonic pulse device. After all, if you're going to plan a prison break, it's best to do it without an audience." 2 hours after they'd lowered me into what everyone expected to be my tomb, I emerged from the pit riding Gus like he was the galaxy's most impressive parade float. The improvised crown I'd fashioned from his naturally shed crystalline armor scales caught the Academy's lights and threw rainbow patterns across the stunned faces of the assembled crowd. The silence was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. You could have heard a pin drop, if pins made sounds when they fell in environments designed for beings with enhanced hearing. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities," I called out, standing up on Gus's broad head while he settled into a regal sitting position. "I'd like to introduce you to my new friend Gus. Gus, meet the people who've been keeping you prisoner for the last few decades." Commander Thexulos looked like someone had just explained quantum mechanics to him using interpretive dance. His mouth was moving, but no sounds were coming out, which was probably the first time in his career that had happened. Prince Veltar, meanwhile, had dropped about 2 feet in altitude, which for a Zephyrian was equivalent to a human's jaw hitting the floor. "This is impossible," he sputtered. "The Crimson Maw is a mindless beast. It cannot be tamed." "Tamed?" I laughed, scratching Gus behind one of his smaller horns. He made a pleased rumbling sound that shook dust from the ceiling. Oh, he was never wild, he was just really annoyed. Turns out, when you keep someone locked up against their will and infested with parasites, they get a bit cranky about unexpected visitors. I pulled out the recording device I'd been carrying throughout my trial, a little piece of tech that Pip had given me for documentation purposes. "I've got about 3 hours of footage showing systematic abuse of a sentient creature, rigged trials designed to eliminate inconvenient students, and enough safety violations to shut down this entire facility." The crowd was starting to murmur now, a mix of languages and species creating a babble of confusion and growing alarm. Some of the other cadets were looking at Gus with something approaching awe rather than fear, especially after he demonstrated his intelligence by carefully picking up a dropped datapad and returning it to its owner. "Furthermore," I continued, warming to my theme, "I've documented evidence that the Academy's character-building exercises are actually elaborate murder attempts disguised as training. The survival rates for non-traditional species are approximately 67% lower than average, which suggests either criminal incompetence or deliberate discrimination." Commander Thexulos finally found his voice. "This is preposterous. You cannot simply waltz out of a death trial and start making accusations." "Watch me," I replied cheerfully. "Gus, would you mind demonstrating your feelings about the current management?" Gus, who had apparently been waiting for just such an invitation, stood up and let out a roar that expressed several decades' worth of accumulated frustration. The sound was so powerful that several windows cracked, and Prince Veltar fell backward into the Academy's ornamental fountain with a splash that was definitely going to stain his ceremonial robes. That's when Admiral Kerrigan arrived. I'd been hoping she'd show up, given that I'd sent her a detailed report about the Academy's irregularities approximately 6 hours before my trial was scheduled to begin. Admiral Kerrigan was the human liaison to the Galactic Military Council, and she had a reputation for taking a dim view of organizations that mistreated her people. She was also my grandmother's former commanding officer, which probably explained why she'd taught me how to document everything and always have an exit strategy. "Cadet Murphy," Admiral Kerrigan said, looking up at me with an expression that might have been pride or might have been exasperation. "I see you've been making friends." "Yes, Ma, I am," I replied. "Gus here was just telling me about his living conditions. I think you'd find his testimony very enlightening." The Admiral's gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on Commander Thexulos and the dripping form of Prince Veltar. I'm sure I would. Perhaps we should discuss this in a more formal setting, along with a few other matters that have come to my attention. As it turned out, my little rebellion had been the final piece of evidence needed to launch a full investigation into the Academy's practices. The arrival of galactic military inspectors tends to have a wonderfully clarifying effect on institutional priorities. 3 months later, I was settling into my new role as senior cadet and unofficial interspecies relations specialist, which was a fancy way of saying the person who talks to things that everyone else is afraid of. Gus had been relocated to a proper habitat in the deep cave systems where his family lived, but he made regular visits to the Academy for what we called consulting work. Turns out, having a 200-year-old crystalline behemoth on your side made a lot of bureaucratic problems disappear really quickly. Commander Thexulos had been reassigned to filing duty on asteroid station Epsilon 7, where his main responsibilities involved organizing supply requisitions in alphabetical order. Forever. Prince Veltar was doing community service teaching proper respect for non-humanoid sentience to a group of particularly unimpressed kindergartners on his home world. The Academy itself had undergone what the inspectors politely termed comprehensive reforms. The new training protocols actually took species differences into account instead of treating them as inconveniences, and the character-building exercises now involved things like teamwork and problem-solving instead of trying not to get eaten. My favorite change was the new admissions policy that actively recruited what the old administration had called problematic species. The current freshman class included Pip's younger sibling, who communicated entirely in geometric proofs, a very anxious tree person named Bark who kept apologizing for existing, and a sentient gas cloud called Whisper who had severe confidence issues despite being able to literally become one with the universe when properly motivated. Probability of successful integration for non-traditional species has increased by 340%. Pip informed me as we watched the new cadets practice basic teamwork exercises. Margin of error, still calculating, but trending positive. Gus was supervising the session from a comfortable spot in the shade, occasionally offering helpful commentary that sounded like a contented landslide. The new students had gotten over their initial terror pretty quickly once they realized he was basically a giant, scaly guidance counselor with excellent advice about dealing with bullies. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said, watching Bark successfully complete an obstacle course designed for his route-based locomotion system while Whisper provided encouragement in the form of gentle breezes. Everyone assumed the beast in the pit was the monster. Turns out, the real monsters were the administrators we met along the way. Admiral Kerrigan, who had dropped by for one of her regular inspections, chuckled. "Your grandmother always said you had a talent for cutting through nonsense and finding the heart of a problem. Though I think she might have underestimated your flair for the dramatic." "Hey," I protested, adjusting my crown of crystalline scales that had become something of a trademark. "When you've got it, flaunt it." The truth was, the whole experience had taught me something important about the nature of monsters and heroes. Most of the time, the creatures we're told to fear are just misunderstood, while the real dangers wear uniforms and speak in bureaucratic jargon. Sometimes the best way to pass a test isn't to follow the rules, but to ask why the rules exist in the first place. And sometimes, when the system is broken, the most heroic thing you can do is break it a little more. As I watched my misfit cadets work together to solve problems that would have been impossible for any of them individually, I felt something that might have been pride. The galaxy was a big, complicated place full of beings who were different from each other in fundamental ways. But those differences weren't obstacles to overcome. They were tools to use. "Come on, Gus," I said, standing up and dusting off my uniform. "I heard there's a report of an undefeatable creature causing problems on Rigel Station. Want to go make a new friend?" Gus's rumble of agreement shook the ground, and somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the sound of another administrator nervously updating their resume. After all, we had a reputation to maintain.